So thank you and welcome to the third year of the Independent Accountability Panel's review of the Energy Charter disclosures. In starting the meeting, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Thank you very much, Powerlink, for your disclosure, and congratulations on your commitment to the Energy Charter and the Better Together initiatives. We have Cassandra Goldie from ACOS and Andrew Richards from the EUAA. Just a few comments in starting. It's regrettable that in 2021, we're still talking about the impact of COVID-19 on individuals, families and businesses around Australia, including energy businesses, as well as natural disasters in some areas and the upsurge in housing pressures around the country and other financial pressures. So on that basis, we consider that the themes of this year's report are likely to be similar to those of last year: affordability of essential services, transition to net zero emissions by 2050 or preferably sooner, with the consequent key issue that no customer should be left behind in that transition, particularly on the basis of affordability. Those themes have generally been confirmed by the stakeholder forums that we've already held, although the comment has been made that instead of talking about making sure customers aren't being left behind, it's been suggested we should be talking about getting ahead. The customers should be ahead, not behind. So we're really here to discuss this with you and the other CEOs of signatory companies to get your perspective and to talk about your disclosure. So we have some questions, but Paul, I'd like to hand over to you initially just to ask you to highlight any key points about your disclosure, then we can open it up for discussion. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And look, mate, if I can just start by acknowledging the traditional owners the land in which our team has gathered, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Look, I guess when we sort of think about the Energy Charter and what we're trying to achieve, the best thing we can do as an organisation, quite honestly, is keep our foot on the throat of the price of electricity. There's all other things that we can do and do, but ultimately, the kilowatt hour is a very regressive metric. It's our customers actually happen to own us. We've got 5 million Queenslanders and they're our owners, and organisations need to sort of try and make that balance between shareholders and customers. But I think if you ask our shareholders, would they prefer a slightly enhanced dividend or a slightly lower electricity price, I think we all know they're going to prefer money in their pockets rather than money in the pockets of a central treasury. So that's sort of very clear in all the actions and the commitments that we make, and I'm sure at least some of you will be approximately aware of what we've done with our most recent regulatory reset with the AER. We've sort of put ourselves in a position of being very uncomfortable. I think we call it constructive discomfort is probably the best term. The other thing organisations like ours can do, though, is also try and provide really good insights and advice to policymakers. They've got other levers at their disposal that we don't have. I mean, look, we could sort of start providing, as an industry, various packages and forms, and you do that by raising your price to other customers. But the kilowatt hour is regressive, and it's a very blunt instrument. You're not likely to target it very well. So we're better to provide the right advice to policymakers on how best to package progressive forms of funding and make sure it's extremely well targeted. And we've done a lot of work in that regard, and we've passed that advice on. There are other things, though, that any good organisation should do. And I'm sure you might recall we flagged last year we'd funded a number of financial counselling scholarships. That's important in somewhere like Queensland, where we do have where we are underweight as a state in terms of financial counsellors, and they do provide very important support to residential customers, in particular our most vulnerable customers. And we specifically targeted a location in Queensland which is it's known to have its fair share of hardship customers, so that was important to us. We've also been involved in supporting some regional sort of education programs, and somehow along the year we managed to knock out an academic paper on fuel poverty and what that means in a state like Queensland, and more specifically how to really target that by pulling levers in a different way without necessarily increasing the amount of money that's actually used to do so, but just being far more targeted and far more effective. The other thing that we did, and I probably should get Jerry to talk about this because he was the one that really led it, but we've commenced a partnership with Uniting Care, which is pretty unusual for a TNSP. We're starting to drift into areas that we probably haven't historically been before, and I guess Claire and Cassandra, Andrew, if you're sort of wondering what sort of impacts that the Energy Charter's had on our organisation, I'm pretty sure that if we weren't going through this process on an annual basis, I'm not sure that we would have ever come up with that sort of initiative, our involvement, and it's not really a traditional domain of a TNSP. So, it's a small thing, but look, it's a start. It's trailblazing in so many ways. I think, in terms of our disclosure statement, I'd probably make the same observation I made last year. By the way, I think last year I'd only been in the job for 2 or 3 months, so I was sort of, I didn't feel like I was standing on cement at the time. It felt a lot more like a trampoline, sort of a bit softer. But the one thing I can say, I said it last year, and I think I've sort of got a much better appreciation of it this year. We've put a pretty honest assessment of ourselves. We haven't tried to overplay our hand. It's sort of not the nature of the organisation to begin with. That's cultural as much as anything else. But we did want to sort of make pretty clear or communicate clearly on what we believe we've done in response to last year. And I think a couple of things that jump out at us. And again, Jerry's been in the trenches on this stuff far more than I have, quite honestly. But our chair, Kathy Hirschfeld, did actually lead that piece on customer voice at the board level, which was, and she did so with great gusto. She was very enthusiastic about taking that on. I think we might have managed to coincide it with one of those little epistles that goes out from the AICD to directors about the importance of customer. Just timing it, sometimes that kind of all aligns, and you get a good response. I think the other thing too, though, is we've been pretty heavily involved in the expansion into that better practice landholder and community engagement piece, and that will be really important. I think when we're talking about the transition, how do we best not leave customers behind? Well, again, just make sure we keep prices as low as we can, and I mean that is always going to be the best thing we can do, is keep prices as low as possible. And if we don't get the community aspect right, we're going to need to expand networks. We're going to be the industry is going to be building renewables in places where we haven't had power generation assets before. So we've got to make sure we do that well, because clearly the difference between doing it badly and well is cost. And that cost ends up finding its way back to someone. Now, we might be lucky, it might be the shareholders, but we could be unlucky and it might be customers. And I think we've got to try and do everything we can to avoid that sort of scenario. Probably the only other thing I need to do, just in my finishing up, Claire, Sandra, and Andrew, is just to flag or acknowledge the role that our customer panel has played over the last 12 months. They're a good group. One of Andrew's colleagues is on there who, and they're really good for us. They put on the brass knuckles and give us a good left hook when we deserve it. And the really nice thing for me though was, I was at a function recently with and one of our panel members was there, and he sort of unprompted came up and just said, the really nice thing about your team, Paul, when we meet with them, when we do sort of give them a bit of frank and fearless feedback, no one in your teams are ever defensive. They just take it on, they go away, digest it, they come back, and even when the stuff we say may be a bit off the mark or a bit crazy, we're treated respectfully, and they either come back with a way of explaining to us why we're off the mark, or they come back saying, yeah, we got it, we need to go away and fix it. So that was sort of nice feedback. I think the one thing our organisation has done really well is the customer engagement piece with a bunch of very sophisticated customers who can speak really elegantly on behalf of the rate base. And that's important. We're not dealing with a bunch of fly-by-nighters. These are serious people who really understand our business, our industry. So they're not going to suffer any nonsense from us. That's for sure, and they've done a great job. Jerry, is there anything else that I have sort of missed in that opening that you think we should be touching on?
Not really, Paul. I think it was a really good point. I think just to sort of add on to that customer panel, we would not have been able to produce the disclosure statement we have without their involvement. We intimately involved them throughout in terms of crafting the content, making sure that they verified it and that it was evidence-based. And yeah, we've actually got a 5-hour meeting with them this afternoon, our last one for the year, and they are a great resource for us to continue to improve our decision making for customers. And so, yeah, a big thanks from me. But other than that, Paul, no, thanks very much.
Thank you both. Andrew Cass, who would like to start?
I think I'm top of the list, Anna Cass. Paul, Jared, Jackie, thank you for that. Thank you for your disclosure. Thank you for your ongoing commitment to this process. It is absolutely crucial. I should say I'm also on the land of the Wurundjeri people today. Paul, it's really easy particularly for government organisations, to stay in their lane and just do what they're told to do and go up to the regs and no more and don't piss anybody off. Reading your disclosure and having an involvement with Powerlink now for quite some time, you're not the kind of organisation that stays in its lane. It is prepared to step out and do different things. And I'm wondering why. And why can't others get out of their lane and do different things? I'm just wondering, what is it about? What do you think? Because it was happening before you were there, but I think it's probably accelerated now that you've been there too. But so it's always, I think, always been part of Powerlink's sort of culture, if you like. Yeah,
Andrew, it's a good question, and I'm trying to think of what, because I think you're right. I might have amplified a few things. I may well have deflated a few too without meaning to do so. But there was a very strong culture inside the organisation when I arrived, particularly within the Reg Reset team and in Jerry's team. There's a sort of a real feeling of responsibility and accountability. And I think what I did manage to do successfully, I think, was catalogue it and call it something, which was, I think the organisation really understands it's here to serve Queenslanders. And sort of the organisation has got well past the idea that we drop off a bit of power to Energex and Ergon. So the organisation's really personalised customers that, okay, we're the big transmission towers, but we consider our customers to be the 5 million Queenslanders that ultimately take the power. And I think that's the trick with it. It's sort of given the organisation almost a real sense of purpose that you just don't get when you talk about supplying power to Energex and Ergon. And interestingly enough, I remember talking to Daniel Westerman from AEMO when he first got in the job, and we actually got talking about this, and he had been through a very similar process over in Great Britain with National Grid. He said, when he first arrived, they considered their customers being the 12 DBs over there, the distribution boards, and they sort of worked out at the executive level that was really a tactical error because it sort of didn't give people a reason to get out of bed and try and do the right thing by customers. But I think, inside the organisation, that's the thing, that's been the trick, is that it's been very, Queenslanders have been very personalised, and I think the organisation's been doing that for a long time, long before I turned up.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be great to see more sort of get outside of their lane, so to speak. It's part of that conversation, though, is that to what extent can the energy industry itself play a role in other aspects of society, and how far should they go and how far can they go? So in that same sort of conversation, how far can you go? And so let's just talk about vulnerability for a moment then. How far can you go in one, picking people up when they become vulnerable, but more importantly, stop them from getting there in the first place? What role do you think you can play in that?
I think the most important role that we and our peers can play is providing, you know, really crisp information that's useful to policymakers, and packaging it and making sure we're prosecuting it in a way that's likely to be well received. And I'll just sort of give you an example of what that looks like. So every year, Energex, Ergon, Powerlink, as a trio, or Energy Queensland and Powerlink, we go out and we do a customer survey, and it's been going on now for, Jerry, would it be 11th year in?
Yeah, the Queensland Household Energy Survey. Yeah, it's about 5,000 Queenslanders are involved in that. It's a very good research base.
So it gives us a lot of really good data to work with. You know, and just to give you if you didn't have that resource, where would you go? Believe it or not, you need to go to the ABS 2014 data set. So if you're in New South Wales, that's your data set. You've got to go to the ABS and a 2014 data set, you know, the Household Energy Survey. By the way, it was a beautiful piece of work, and anyone who's familiar with the data set, the insights it can give you on what to do about and how to think about packaging supports for household, it's an excellent place to start. Problem is, it's now 7 years old. So whereas the data we've got, we're starting to sort of see what's happening with, you know, what's happening with the levels of consumption, not just sort of, you know, in what locations are they rising or falling? What are their incomes doing? What's the relative pattern of stress? Are they worrying as much about electricity as they used to? And by the way, Andrew, the good news is those numbers are getting better, not worse, which is, gee, it's a nice, you know, nice bit of data to be receiving. But there's still, in our state, there's still 150,000 people who meet the definition of fuel poverty.
Mm.
It's a, you know, there's only 2.1 million households here in Queensland. There's a lot of them, you know, and so even with everything we've done, even after, and then when you layer in the sort of supports that are available, you know, that reduces the number a bit, but not as much as you'd think. So then the trick for us as an organisation, for an industry, is it's a lot better now than it was 5 years ago, because the price of electricity is 25% lower today than it was 5 years ago. So if we were doing the same.
Yeah, I just was going to, that's a great, if you wouldn't mind, I just want to pick up on that analysis that you've really usefully provided. You know, I love a company and a leader who wants to work with the data because it will actually tell us a story, really. But the issue for us now is that it's telling a story we know really well. And this notion that somehow hardship and vulnerability is a sort of a marginal small group, it's about consumer behaviours, is just not the reality, right? It's often where the narrative goes, but this is big and systemic now in terms of the scale of energy poverty. And also, if you were to put a group of the energy advocates in a room together and said, what are your top 5? It'd be pretty clear what they are in terms of the big levers that we need to pull to get a very, you know, change to it. I think what we're highlighting, and we're, you know, we'll see what the panel's final report looks like, is, but the scale of accelerating the divide is something that's kind of alarming now, you know, where because of the sort of approach to technologies and the fact that if you're well resourced, you're getting ahead of the game, you're ahead of the game in the current system, the people who've got the most resources are actually paying the least for their bills. That's where we are. I'd love to, and you know, with the intellectual work that you've done as a company, and you know, with this work on energy poverty, for you to highlight for us as a leader in this signatory group, what would be your top 3 that you would want to see action on now to really drive this change? Our theme is in the Charter Principles, you can see vulnerability is put as principle number 5. We're kind of going, let's get it to the front, because actually if we fix the system for vulnerability, it'll have a massive flow-on effect right through. And we've just had an engagement with one of your colleagues who very importantly makes the point, it is this, the business case is as strong as you get to fix this, right? For companies, it really is. It's compelling. Is it politics? Is it companies don't want to put their head up and criticise out there? You know, I think I noticed, Paul, you talked about providing information. Yep. Well, there's more to it than the information, you know, isn't there? So what would be your top 3?
So first of all, I'll if you think about a household, a vulnerable household here in Queensland, and what that looked like in, say, and let's just pick a date, let's say 2017, what they were paying for their electricity. It was about $2,000 a year, and then they'd get support if they had the right support. And there was a big policy change up here back in 2017. All of a sudden, that family would qualify for the first time for hardship, you know, sort of hardship support up here. So that would give you $329. Helpful. It's better than a poke in the eye. What I'd rather sort of see them do is, so first of all, if we dial the clock forward to 2021, their bill's now $1,500. So they've actually got $500 from the industry. So it was better than the hardship scheme itself. But the hardship scheme's still there. So now, instead of being on the hook for about $1,700 a year after hardship payments, or the concession, as we call it up here, the electricity concession, that same vulnerable household is on the hook for $1,200. In fact, it's probably about $1,150, I guess. I think the hardship payment's gone up a little bit. So that's useful. So we've gone from a starting point of $2,000 at the start of 2017. You had a change in policy and a huge drop in price. That's what I mean by the best thing that I think our organisations can do is keep our foot on, as I sort of say, our foot on the throat of prices, and then keep them there. And then I guess the third thing. So the first thing was lower price. Second thing was making sure our concessions are targeted and at the right sort of levels. Third thing I'd say is Cassandra, you've really got to go to the appliance stock. That's we've sort of price, government support, quantity. I mean, they're the 3 great levers, and I think the sort of the quantity side is the piece that I know the Queensland government had a good run at in, I think it was, I'm going to have a stab and say 2018 or 2019. They ran an appliance scheme up here. I don't know how successful. I didn't keep an eye on it because I shot down to Sydney at the time. But I think that was where the Queensland government went to over a period of time with a certain set budget to try and move the dial on, sort of more efficient appliances in households to lower the quantity side, price, quantity and support. They're always, I think that's where we've got to go, isn't it, Cassandra?
Yep. I mean, there are now, the country is littered with wonderful small scale examples of that good work that proves every single time that you get the energy efficiency arrangements right in households, and it has a dramatic effect on the size of the bill. So is that the one that as a sector, as an industry, particularly signatories, because this is, I think what the purpose of the charter was to go, we're going to go out the front and make the case and put our skin in the game and say, this is the bit that we are prepared to do to get that China change at scale. Is that the one? Because it's raised with us by the consumer advocates all the time, quite correctly, I think. It's not that we don't know what to do.
Yeah. Look, Cassandra, and I must confess, I haven't sort of spent a huge amount of time thinking about it for any time recently, but you know, as I sit here reflecting on it, is it the one that we probably need to go and turn our minds to next year? It probably is. I mean, I think we're on the price side of things. We've just about locked ourselves in, you know, out to the year 2027, so we won't be able to do much more there, you know, within our own organisation. Although I would say, you know, a really big part of our strategy going forward is trying to alter the business model of networks. You know, and I think we spoke about this last time. You know, there's sort of this sort of vision that we need a lot more transmission, and then all you do is you just get customers to open up and say and we just sort of shove the additional tariff down their throat. And I'm not sure. To me, that seems like a very sort of sensible starting point. And we've been lucky up here in Queensland. We've got a government who I think sort of has recognised that and have actually given us a bit of bandwidth to try a few different things. So one is they've set up a fund for us to go tap. They probably expect us to get a return out of it at some point. You know, it's not sort of free money per se. It's not the intent. But what it does do is it enables us to not put it in the regulatory asset base. That it gives us breathing space to be able to work out where we can find generators to fund it. Now, every now and then someone says, oh, well, you know, if the generators are funding it, then it's going to come back to us. Well, maybe, but look, in my experience, not all supply side players get paid. That's the beauty of our market. You do a stupid investment, you know, it's the shareholders who cop it, not the consumers. And that's a really important difference. And that's why we've tried to change that business model. We sort of hope that the generators pay us, of course. We don't want to make bad investments for all obvious reasons, but actually sort of starting to work out who's the beneficiary of that piece of equipment, it does change the narrative a bit. And the fact that our state government sort of being prepared to stump up with quite a decent sized fund for us has given us the breathing space to be able to do some clever things on the supply side. Because we've also, I mean, I think one of the nuances in the most recent strategy, in fact, it's Jackie's team who's done all this for us, but a real nuance in our strategy is we're not just focused on the transmission price, we're sort of thinking bulk supply price, because our network can have a profound impact on the generation and transmission price. And of course, the generation price is a big number, right? It's not small. So we need to be really thoughtful about how those prices and charges flow through. Then back to the conversation on the appliance or the quantity side, Cassandra. Look, we've got good data. We probably need to go away and have a really good look at that. We generally get it in the context of dollars rather than kilowatt hours, but it's pretty easy to go and reverse engineer what those look like and then start swimming in it to see where the, you know, what the best sort of outcome is. Because we also know with that survey data of ours, and it's very good representative survey data, who actually has the panels on their roofs and who are we leaving behind or not. So we've got enough of a footprint there to be able to make some reasoned assessments of what would constitute good policy in that regard.
I think I'm just highlighting it because, of course, in the context of the transition, and you'll probably want to speak a bit to that, Andrew, you know, one of the issues that often gets raised is the reason that we can't necessarily move is because of the size of energy bills. I'm going, well, actually, the most effective thing you could do to help tackle the size of the energy bill for people on low incomes is not, there are really obvious things that can be done that are entirely, you know, they stack up on a business case, they stack up on technology, they stack up on jobs to have a much more powerful effect than, you know, any arguments on the other front. So
I might jump in there unless
thanks.
You want to go on to another question, but I thought I'd just pick up a couple of comments from Andrew and also your questions, Cassandra. You asked what are the three things. I think so to Andrew's point, I think that network businesses are changing and evolving, and we have to, because we're in the middle of a transformational period for the power system. And so the division that I'm leading is called Energy Futures, and that's a title that hasn't existed until the last 12 months. And I see quite a few other businesses have now got divisions or titles around the future energy system. But the work that I think one of the three things that we can do is actually focus on the future power system and how do we move through the transformation most efficiently and smoothly, because that's what's going to decide what the prices are in future. So I know that there are issues right now, but I think the way that we navigate the next 10 years will have a big impact on prices for all customers for the future. And that's something that the division I'm leading is really focused on. And I think we are looking, so again, to Andrew's point, you know, why are we changing and how are we doing it, or why might it be happening faster in Queensland? I think it's partly the interaction with government and the different ownership structure here gives us an avenue to work very closely with government, and that's what we're doing to try and navigate the smoothest path through the transition. And the fund that there's a couple of funds that Queensland government have put up to assist with that. But I think there's modelling Business Council of Australia and a couple of other places that show that there's a huge gap between the coordination is a key factor, and lack of coordination could cost the economy, you know, trillions and vice versa if we get it right. So I think that coordination between the networks, the generators and government policy is key to getting a smooth and efficient transition to our, you know, more renewables and so on. And I think that's a big factor in future energy prices for all Queenslanders. That is really key to our work as well. And I think the Queensland government announced a few weeks ago that they are preparing a Queensland energy plan. And we were literally in there yesterday talking to them about that, and also just realising that whilst it's called the Queensland Energy Plan, it really is an economic plan. And to your point, jobs and how we move through the transition from one type of generation to another is going to be critical to the income of our customers, as well as the bills that they'll be receiving in future. So I think those are a key focus for our business for the future. So, you know, there are things that people are doing right now, but I think the future is well, certainly what I'm focusing on, and how do we get there most efficiently.
I think I just might jump in as well, Andrew, with that. Why are we more comfortable swimming out of our lane? And I had my customer engagement hat on. You know, Powerlink's never been short of technical expertise within the business or great ideas. But if you actually effectively engage with the customers early, get their input, insights, it actually gives you the confidence to do something different or to be the first person to do that thing in the industry, because we're not just basing it off our own internal discussions. We've actually had the right conversations with our customers. We've tested it. We've used the data through our multiple research programs. It actually gives us confidence. And when we go out there, we actually think there's a pretty good chance that this is a good idea. But you can only do that when you've actually meaningfully engaged with your customers up front. And so I think that also allows us to sort of, you know, break new ground in certain areas. And I think the other thing which Paul has really sort of done really well is what Jackie's alluded to, is we've really changed our eyes. We don't just look down on the transmission sort of blinker. We are looking at every decision we make from that whole of power system. And that's why we need to do more on the end use vulnerable customer. You know, you can't say that we're taking a whole of system view and then not think about how we can have a direct benefit and input in those vulnerable customers, those Queensland households that are struggling at the moment.
This is a really important conversation because it's about the several $100 billion of new investment we need to make over the coming 20 years as we transition. And so it's not necessarily what we do, is what I'm hearing here, is but how you do it is where the money is, and where you can either actually have a really low cost or efficient transition, or you can have a really messy, expensive one. So Paul, back to your comments too, I think it's obviously, as you would know, a topic very close to our heart. We're trying to get more of those costs in market rather than out of market. This idea that it seems that is where you've landed to as well, that this idea that it's efficient to put everything in the RAB. Well, it's clearly efficient for a new entrant generator to put it in the RAB because they don't pay for it. But it doesn't send the right price signal to the right people to do the right things. It dulls the market signal down. So that's obviously very supportive of that. The other thing that I guess you're coming to terms with, and big transmission companies particularly, going from this steady state of running a network to be very much more of a construction company and a developer as you're building all the new stuff. Because that can actually lead to vulnerability and bad outcomes in communities as well, as you.
Yeah.
So what's the plan there when you are marching out and connecting renewables and building reses and building new transmission, hopefully co-funded by the people connecting to it? But what's the plan around community for that?
So I'm just going to make a couple of opening comments, Andrew, and I might actually flip to Jerry because his team are in the trenches on this, and it'll be good to get Jerry, get it straight from the mouth rather than sort of, the generalized version from me. First of all, and I want to make that point about the, development construction. Right now is a really bad time to do big projects. So our strategy is to not do them. So we are trying to not do any big projects at all. We're trying to shoot with a rifle. And when we are shooting with rifles, we are getting those co-funding from the generators because that's the only basis on which we'll do it. Now, we might need to bridge a gap for them because they can't pay for all of it because we want to size the connection efficiently. And there's lots, and we're having to deal with three extremities on that, but we have cracked the nut on how to do that under all three extremities, whether you've got a big lot of generators turning up all the way through to a small number with a lot of capacity to go. And what all three of them have got in common is that all three of those solutions, none of them lower it into the regulatory asset base for mums and dads to be paying for. It all goes somewhere else other than mums and dads. But let me swing over to your substantive question about when we do need to go into a community, and we are right now. We've got a couple of live, renewable energy zones that we're working on. They're not $1 billion ones. They're 150 million. They're clever ones. They'll get 1,800 megawatts of generation in. So fabulous. They're really low cost, really big capacity renewable energy zones, but they are going to be traversing, people's communities. So Jerry, do you want to maybe just talk through that?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, we identified as a gap that we had was a sort of a real corporate level community engagement strategy. Obviously, we know as part of the transition, energy infrastructure will need to be built. And a lot of that will probably be built in communities that have never had energy infrastructure before. So we as part of the Better Together initiative that Paul's referred to, we actually work really, really closely with the National Farmers Federation, Queensland Farmers Federation, Transgrid, to actually develop up a better practice engagement guideline to actually drive some consistency across jurisdictions. And so that was like a perfect example of a customers coming to the energy charter with an issue. Like they saw on the ground really inconsistent approaches for engagement with the community. How do we actually get some more consistency, whether it's happening in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, wherever it might be. So that was a really worthwhile resource. In addition to that, we had our own internal sort of community engagement strategy document that we've just only recently launched, and that plugged a gap. From a project lifecycle perspective, Powerlink probably over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, we haven't really built too much sort of new greenfield work. So we probably didn't sort of properly focus on making sure that we were properly engaging with those communities. We have got that front and center now as an organisation. We've actually also really interestingly just finished off some very detailed community sentiment research into sort of southwestern Queensland communities. And that was really about trying to understand what actually drives trust and social license acceptance in communities that potentially will have new wind farm development, but also our existing infrastructure. Like we also impact on these communities by going out and maintaining these existing assets. And so again, our sort of model is rather than actually us just coming up with something internally, we want to go out and try and get those customer insights first. And with this data, which again, the final report is coming in the next week or so, it's really interesting. about what is driving within those communities that are looking at new renewable energy development. What are they wanting? What are they not wanting? And then that then helps us truly to shape our engagement approach with these communities on the ground. How do we best create, mutual value opportunities? Everyone sort of says, yep, let's do a community partnership program. Yeah, that's great. But like, what are they actually after? Let's not assume that we know what these communities value. So it's a combination of, engage early, I think, is an absolute foundation of good quality conversation with customers, but it's also making sure that we're not making assumptions. A rural community in southern Queensland is going to be driven by totally different factors to one up in northern Queensland. So we really are trying to take a fit for purpose approach. And these will be difficult. When as part of these projects, there will be community impacts, but it's about, from a cost perspective, it's about minimizing the costs, but also about engaging with these communities, having the conversations early enough that we can minimize the construction impacts, and then also create, long-lasting community benefits for those residents that we are operating in.
It sounds like a co-design process.
Co-designs. I'm big on co-design, Andrew, as you might know.
My burning question, and I know Claire's about to start to try and move us down, and I often go, can we just have some more time?
I know.
Maybe it's more an ask of you, because I see the collaboration you've got with the academic community and the commitment to the, the university centre. In terms of the transition and employment opportunities and, the risks and community sentiment, the most critical one will be how to support people who are more disadvantaged, who aren't as empowered, whose voices don't get heard as much, to be at the front of those employment opportunities. So if you've got anything you say, we're on it, it would be great to hear that now. But that is, I think, one of the most critical questions. We've certainly got that in, in the social policy area. We're very worried about that.
But I think probably one of the more helpful things an organisation like us can do at the moment, we're building a transmission line to connect up a pumped hydro project up in North Queensland, and it traverses about 185 kilometre pathway, and it's a pretty big project, right? It's hundreds of millions of dollars, and a lot of money is going to get spent on the ground. If we just sort of rolled up there and did it, the majority of the work that would fall out of that for local organisations would probably tend to get hoovered up by those that are up in Townsville or Cairns and sophisticated enough to do it. What our team did, and it was actually Jerry's team that did it, we sort of rolled into all the various communities up there and explained to them what a lumbering giant Powerlink is, how our procurement processes work, what sort of things you might need to put in place now before we actually turn up and start, tendering out the work and so on. And this was everything from, just remind me, Jackie and Jerry, everything from, snake bite sort of kits all the way through to providing lunches for, hundreds of people on the ground, or you can imagine all the various services that you need when you're building and you've got a whole bunch of people screaming up and down a transmission corridor. So there is lots we can do, and we can generate a lot of and this is it's going to be a sort of a 2 or 3 year program of work there that that sprinkles a lot of fairy dust around, provided we can explain to people ahead of time how awkward we are to deal with, and then it becomes easy. But if you're trying to respond to us in real time, it's impossible, because you're caught on the back foot. These town halls that we've been running have been unbelievably well attended.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is you go to them and speak to them in person, if you know what I mean. It's not about setting up a process where they have to go through a number of hoops to actually learn about the potential employment opportunity. And so that's really, really important. COVID's probably hindered some of that in terms of getting out on the ground, but hopefully, fingers crossed, 2022 will enable us to get a lot more out to those regional communities that are going to be having the opportunity for local employment, because that's the crucial thing, is trying to get to them in a face-to-face setting as much as possible.
Look, Cass,
And as early as possible too, you know, in terms of confidence that actually the people who are most at risk are at the front of that plan rather than, you know,
Yeah.
when it hits the newspapers in a few years' time kind of thing. Yep. Thanks, Claire.
no, that's fine. And I'm really sorry that we have to draw this to a conclusion. It's been a really very, very helpful discussion. Thank you. And I'm sorry we don't have more time to do it, but we have a very full day of interviews. So we really appreciate your disclosure and your time and the very frank discussion. So our report will be out in December, and then we'll talk to you on the CEO Council. So thanks very much to the three of you for your time today.
Right.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Cassandra.
Bye.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks to you all.
See you
See you
soon.
later.
Bye.
Bye.